Aisha was a young girl born into a life of hardship. She lived in a small village where survival was a daily struggle. Her family had always been poor, but recent misfortunes had made things even worse. Her father, once a hard-working labourer, had fallen ill, leaving her mother to take care of the household. With no stable income and debts piling up, the family often went to sleep hungry. Despite the hardships, Aisha had dreams. She longed for a better life, one where she could study, work, and escape the chains of poverty. But in their village, dreams did not feed empty stomachs. Reality was cruel, and for a girl like her, options were limited. One day, an unexpected proposal arrived. Sikandar, an old but extremely wealthy man from a nearby town, had shown interest in marrying her. He was a man of power and influence, someone who could easily wipe away all of her family's financial struggles. However, there was a significant age gap between them, and the thought of marrying him filled Aisha with dread. Her parents saw the proposal as a blessing. They reminded her of their hardships, of the nights they had slept without food, of the debt collectors who came knocking at their door. They told her this marriage was not just for her, but for the entire family's survival. Her mother held her hands, tears in her eyes, pleading with her to say yes. Aisha felt trapped. Her heart wanted to scream, to run away, but her love for her family held her back. With a heavy heart and tears streaming down her face, she agreed to the marriage, not knowing that her wedding night would bring an unexpected shock. The day of the wedding arrived, but instead of joy, Aisha felt only despair. Dressed in a heavily embroidered red bridal outfit, she looked like a queen, yet inside, she felt like a prisoner. Her hands, adorned with henna, trembled as she wiped away silent tears. The sound of celebratory music echoed through the grand hall, yet all she could hear was the deafening cry of her own heart. The ceremony was lavish, far beyond anything she had ever imagined. Golden chandeliers lit up the venue. Tables were filled with exquisite dishes, and the guests, dressed in their finest attire, marveled at the extravagance. Everyone spoke about Sikandar's wealth, his generosity, and his power. No one spoke about the young bride who sat beside him with hollow eyes. Relatives came forward to congratulate her, smiling as if this was the happiest day of her life. Some even whispered that she was fortunate. After all, how many poor girls got to marry into such luxury? Her mother leaned in, her voice filled with forced cheerfulness, and said, "You are lucky, Aisha. You will never have to worry about hunger or struggle again." But Aisha could not bring herself to agree. As she looked at Sikandar, sitting calmly beside her, she felt a pang of fear and sadness. He was old enough to be her father, and though his face carried wisdom, to her, it was a reminder of the life she was about to enter, a life she had never wished for. Aisha's mind raced with doubts. Was wealth truly worth this sacrifice? Would gold and jewels ever fill the emptiness she felt inside? As the final wedding rituals were completed, she realized that no matter how grand this day appeared to others, to her it marked the end of everything she had once hoped for. The wedding celebrations had ended, and now Aisha was being taken to her new home, Sikandar's mansion. As the car approached the enormous gates, her heart pounded violently. The house was unlike anything she had ever seen before, grand, magnificent, and cold. Huge chandeliers illuminated the massive halls, and servants stood in perfect rows, waiting to welcome their new mistress. Yet, none of it brought her any comfort. She felt like a stranger entering a world where she did not belong. Her footsteps felt heavy as she was guided up the grand staircase to the bedroom. Each step increased her fear. The room was beautifully decorated for the wedding night. Red rose petals scattered on the bed, scented candles flickering in the dim light. But Aisha could not appreciate any of it. She was too consumed by the terror of what was to come. Sitting on the massive bed, she wrapped her arms around herself, trying to calm her trembling body. She had heard countless stories from other girls in her village, stories of wedding nights where brides had no choice but to submit, no matter how scared or unwilling they were. She imagined Sikandar forcing himself upon her, and the thought made her shiver. Was this her fate? Was this what her life had come to? The door creaked open, and her heart nearly stopped. Sikandar entered the room, his presence commanding yet oddly gentle. He did not rush toward her, nor did he look at her like a man eager to claim his bride. Instead, he walked slowly to a chair near the window and sat down. Aisha clenched her fists, waiting for him to speak, to tell her what he expected from her, but he remained silent for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke in a calm voice. "You don't have to be afraid." She looked up at him, confused. He sighed, as if he had already known what she was thinking. "I will not touch you unless you want me to." Aisha's breath caught in her throat. She had prepared herself for the worst, but this she had not expected. She stared at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Aisha sat frozen, unable to believe what she had just heard. Sikandar's words echoed in her mind. "I will not touch you unless you want me to." Was this some kind of trick? Had she misunderstood him? She'd spent the entire day drowning in fear, preparing for a nightmare. But now, the man she had dreaded was telling her she had nothing to fear. Sikandar leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, yet weary. "I know you don't want this marriage," he said, his voice steady, but filled with something unspoken. "I never wanted it either." Aisha's eyes widened. She had assumed that, like most old men who married young girls, he had done this out of selfishness, to fulfill some personal desire. But here he was, admitting that he too had been forced into it. "Then, why did you agree?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sikandar let out a long sigh. "My family insisted. They thought I needed someone to take care of me in my old age. They believed that marrying a young girl would ensure I had a companion, someone who could look after my household and my business when I am gone." Aisha felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. She had expected cruelty, but instead, she was seeing a man who looked more burdened than dominant. "But why me?" she asked hesitantly. For the first time, a hint of sadness crossed Sikandar's face. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "I have been ill for a long time, Aisha. The doctors have given me only a few months, maybe a year at best. I didn't want to leave my wealth to greedy relatives who only pretend to care. I wanted it to go to someone who truly needed it." Aisha's breath hitched. He was dying. She looked at the man before her, no longer as the terrifying figure she had imagined, but as a person carrying the weight of his own fate. All the fear she had felt earlier started to fade, replaced by something else. Pity, understanding, and a strange sense of guilt. She had spent so much time fearing him, but he had never intended to hurt her. Sikandar's voice softened. "I know you must have hated me when you were forced into this, but believe me, Aisha, I would never force anything upon you. You are free to live in this house however you choose. You can have your own space, your own life. I will never ask anything of you." Aisha could feel the tears welling in her eyes. But this time, They were not tears of fear. They were tears of confusion, of relief, and of the overwhelming realization that her life had not taken the turn she had expected. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to breathe. Aisha sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process everything Sikandar had just told her. She had spent weeks dreading this night, imagining all the terrible things that might happen to her. Yet, in a single conversation, everything had changed. The old man she had feared was not a monster, not a selfish man who had married her for his own pleasure. Instead, he was someone carrying a burden far greater than hers, his own impending death. She did not know what to say. Should she thank him? Should she apologize for all the resentment she had felt toward him? No words seemed appropriate. All she could do was stare at him, still trying to grasp the truth. Sikandar, however, did not seem to expect a response. He simply stood up from his chair and walked toward the door. "Get some rest," he said gently. "No one will disturb you. If you need anything, the servants will be outside." And with that, he left, closing the door softly behind him. Aisha sat on the bed, staring at the empty space where he had been. She had been prepared for so much: anger, force, humiliation, but not this, not kindness, not respect. In the days that followed, she watched Sikandar with new eyes. He never imposed his presence on her. He never asked her to fulfill any duties as his wife. Instead, he treated her as an individual, giving her space to adjust to her new life. The mansion, which had once felt like a prison, now seemed less threatening. The fear that had gripped her heart slowly loosened its hold. She started to notice things about Sikandar that she had ignored before. The way he spoke to the servants with kindness, never raising his voice. The way he sat in his study for hours, reading or working, never showing signs of frustration. The way his eyes, though filled with wisdom, carried a quiet sadness that only someone who had accepted their fate could have. At first, Aisha kept her distance, unsure of how to behave around him. But as time passed, a strange sense of comfort settled between them. They began to have small conversations, brief exchanges at the dining table, quiet moments in the garden. She learned that he had once been a man full of life, passionate about business and travel, but his illness had taken much of that away from him. And he, in turn, learned about her dreams, her love for books, and the simple joys she had once hoped for. She had married him unwillingly, believing him to be her worst nightmare. But now she saw him for what he truly was, a man who had given her freedom when he could have taken everything from her. And with that realization, the resentment in her heart began to fade, replaced by something she never expected to feel: respect. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. What had started as an unwanted marriage began to transform into something entirely unexpected. Aisha no longer felt like a prisoner in Sikandar's mansion. Instead, she found herself growing, learning, and discovering a part of herself she never thought she would be allowed to explore. Sikandar, true to his word, never once imposed any demands on her. Instead, he encouraged her to think beyond the life she had left behind. One evening, as they sat in the garden, he placed a few books in front of her. "You once told me you wanted to study," he said. "You should start now." Aisha hesitated. No one had ever cared about her education before. In her village, girls were expected to marry young and dedicate their lives to their families. The idea that she could study, that she could build a future of her own, felt foreign. I don't know where to begin," she admitted. Sikandar smiled, a rare but warm expression. "Then let's start with what interests you." With his guidance, Aisha slowly regained the confidence to pursue her education. She spent hours reading, asking questions, and learning about subjects she had never been exposed to before. More than anything, she was fascinated by the way Sikandar ran his business. She had never imagined herself in a position of power. But the more she observed, the more she realized she wanted to understand how the world of finance and leadership worked. One day, after weeks of watching him manage his company from his study, she finally asked, "Can you teach me?" Sikandar looked at her, surprised but pleased. "Are you sure?" She nodded, determination shining in her eyes. "I want to learn." And so, he began to train her. He explained business strategies, financial planning, and leadership principles. At first, it was overwhelming, but Aisha absorbed everything like a sponge. She took notes, asked questions, and even sat in on his meetings, observing how he handled negotiations with confidence and wisdom. Over time, he started letting her take small responsibilities, handling documents, overseeing minor transactions, and even speaking to some of his employees. The more she learned, the more she realized she had a natural talent for it. For the first time in her life, she felt valued. Not as someone's daughter, not as someone's wife, but as an individual with potential. The resentment she had once harbored against Sikandar melted away. Instead, it was replaced by admiration. He had given her something no one else had ever given her, a chance. One evening, as they sat together reviewing business reports, Aisha turned to him and said, "Thank you." Sikandar looked at her, confused. "For what?" "For believing in me," she said softly, "for giving me a life I never thought I could have." He smiled, nodding as if he had always known she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. "You were never meant for a small life, Aisha. You just needed someone to remind you of that." And in that moment, she realized that her marriage, which had once felt like a curse, had turned into the very thing that set her free. Time moved forward, but Sikandar's health moved in the opposite direction. His illness, which had remained stable for months, suddenly took a turn for the worse. The man who had once commanded rooms with his presence now struggled to even stand without assistance. His once sharp, calculating mind was clouded by pain and exhaustion. Aisha, who had once resented this marriage, now found herself by his side, caring for him in ways she never thought she would. When the doctors finally admitted him to the hospital, she knew in her heart that this was the beginning of the end. His condition deteriorated quickly, and despite the best medical care, there was little that could be done. The man who had given her freedom, education, and purpose was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. One evening, as she sat beside his hospital bed, Sikandar took her hand in his weak grasp. His voice was barely a whisper, but his words were firm. "I have made all the arrangements," he said. "Everything I own, it's yours now." Aisha's eyes welled up with tears. "I don't want your wealth, Sikandar," she said, her voice trembling. "I just want you to be okay." He gave her a faint smile, his tired eyes filled with the wisdom and kindness she had come to admire. "You are not the same girl I married, Aisha. You are strong, capable, and independent. I know you will do something meaningful with what I leave behind." 2 days later, Sikandar took his last breath. His passing left a void in Aisha's heart, but she did not allow grief to consume her. Instead, she did exactly what he had believed she would do. She used her newfound power to make a difference. With Sikandar's wealth and business now under her control, Aisha took a path that no one had expected. She did not waste her fortune on luxuries or meaningless indulgences. Instead, She created opportunities for young girls who had been in the same position she once was, trapped in poverty, forced into unwanted marriages, and denied the right to dream. She built educational institutions in villages, providing free schooling for underprivileged girls. She set up shelters for women escaping forced marriages, giving them a safe space to rebuild their lives. She employed women in her company, training them in business and finance, ensuring that they too could stand on their own feet. Aisha no longer saw herself as a victim. The girl who had once cried on her wedding day had now become a beacon of hope for others. She had turned her pain into strength, her suffering into purpose. And as she looked at the empire Sikandar had left behind, she knew that his belief in her had not been in vain. She had become the woman he always knew she could be. Aisha had once been a helpless girl, forced into a marriage she never wanted, crying on her wedding day as she feared a future she could not escape. But life had unfolded in ways she never imagined. The very marriage she had dreaded had become the turning point that transformed her into a woman of strength, wisdom, and purpose. She no longer saw herself as the poor village girl who had no choices. Now, she was an independent, educated, and powerful woman, leading a business empire and changing lives. The lessons Sikandar had taught her, the kindness he had shown, and the opportunities he had given her had shaped her into someone she was proud to be. Looking back, Aisha realized that sometimes fate worked in strange ways. What had once seemed like a curse had been a hidden blessing. Her marriage had not taken away her freedom. It had given her the tools to claim it for herself. She didn't cry anymore, not out of sorrow, regret, or fear. If she shed tears now, they were out of gratitude. Gratitude for the man who had seen potential in her. Gratitude for the strength she had discovered within herself. And gratitude for the chance to make a difference in the lives of other girls who had once felt just as trapped as she had. Aisha was no longer a victim of her circumstances. She was the master of her own destiny.